Welcome to Determine Out Loud, our podcast series that's all about minding your business in contract management and source to pay. And now, your host, Buyers Meeting Point owner, Kelly Varner.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Determine Out Loud. Today, my guest is Reginald Peterson, Director of Supply Management Programs at Corcentric. Welcome, Reggie. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, Kelly. Nice to be here. How are you?
I am doing just fine. So one of the topics that we've been looking forward to discussing and that we're going to focus on today actually has an awful lot to do with the digital transformation topic that we so frequently discuss in procurement. Now, in its simplest level, right, when we talk about digital transformation, we're thinking of taking manual or paper-based processes and moving them into databases and applications. But there's always an additional level of work that we can do with direct systems to systems integration. And so the piece of the procurement world that we're going to look at talking about transforming digitally today is e-invoicing. If you don't mind getting us started with sort of a baseline, where would you say we are today in terms of the percentage of suppliers that are already set up and using e-invoicing versus those that still either have to or choose to work, the traditional way in paper copy?
Sure, Kelly. I think, from my perspective and the suppliers I work with, I think about 80 to 90% of the suppliers are prefer e-invoicing or working with e-invoicing versus the other 10 to 20% that do not. And I know that seems a little high, but when you think about the types of suppliers we work with, it really isn't divided by industry or the products or services or how mature they are. It really is, really the size and those available resources that those suppliers have to go towards an e-invoicing or an electronic e-commerce platform.
Now, one of the interesting things I think about technology today for business is that you can actually access applications that are deceptively mature and maybe even sophisticated without being large traditional enterprise solutions. So in terms of examples, I think of payroll solutions, I think of email databases and, email blast solutions that make you look sophisticated, social media automation. Is there anything of that type that affects e-invoicing that would allow a relatively small supplier to have kind of the same functionality or play on equal footing with something that a much larger enterprise would have in place?
Yeah, I think so. When we look at what e-invoicing is and how it can help a company become more automated, it does appear that the smaller suppliers, when they onboard a e-invoicing solution, this sort of put them in that same realm with some of these bigger companies, and it does give the appearance of them being a little bit more mature, a little bit more with it, if you will,
okay.
As it relates to how they work with their customers.
Now, when we talk about e-invoicing, when we're encouraging them to go down that road, does it have any connotation that suppliers think, oh, okay, if I do this, if I automate this, if I invest in connecting here, it naturally means I'm going to get paid sooner, right? That me connecting my system to your system, is that implied? Is that part of the business case or the decision-making process, or is it other kinds of benefits that tend to incentivize suppliers to go down that road?
Yeah, I think all of that. I mean, we do bring that up to suppliers about them getting paid, but not sooner. I mean, there are other factors involved in how a supplier get paid. So when we're talking about a supplier getting paid sooner, just to give you context, we're talking about what is the payment term, right? Whether or not they're part of some type of supply chain financing program where they're getting paid earlier. What we do bring up, though, as far as advantages that they can receive is that, it does eliminate lost invoices, late, and it prevents late payments because of the fact that, with an e-invoicing platform, the invoice is processed through electronically, and so there is no such thing as a lost invoice. I mean, and data, very few instances where data is just wrong, and discrepancies are actually reduced tremendously. And we also talk about how much labor intense processing manual invoices are. I mean, we've noted that there's like a 25% improvement in labor productivity when they move to a invoicing platform, and a 90 to 95% reduction in how much paperwork is being processed. So those are some of the things that we also pitch. And then the most important thing really is the approval process. Every company wants to make sure that they're not being defrauded, or they're paying for the right things, that that the expenditures that they're using goes directly into the business. So everybody wants an approval process. The question is whether or not you want that approval process to be manual, whether you want that paper to sit on someone's desk until they get back from vacation or any travel trips that they're taking, or business travel that they're taking, or do you want electronically where the approver can actually access that invoice to view it and approve it from anywhere that has a Wi-Fi connection?
Well, and it's actually an interesting case that you make. I mean, if you can reduce the amount of manual time that someone at that small supplier has to spend processing invoices, it actually has a disproportionately larger benefit to them. The less people you have on staff, the more valuable every single person's minute is while they're in the office. And so certainly, I mean, every company of every size wants to be more efficient with their labor. It's a huge expense, but it's a much better ROI for a smaller supplier to get that time back.
No, absolutely. And we talked a little bit about this, internally, and about, what is it that company is in the business of doing?
Yeah.
Processing invoices is not it. No. It's whatever your core competence is, right. whatever is keeping the lights on, how much you're manufacturing. The resource-based theory suggests that, that people, companies need to concentrate a little bit more, their resources more on their core competency versus all these other types of functions that it can be a resource drain.
Now, if we also think about these suppliers as being smaller, and given that the majority of the Determine Out Loud listening audience is, in procurement or some related function, right? So we're thinking about the buy side of any contractual agreement. If you suggest to a supplier that they go down this path of investing in implementing e-invoicing, what kind of support or hand-holding or advisory role should you expect to have to play if you give this advice and the supplier takes it? Is it as simple as they say, oh yeah, this is great advice, and they go off and act on it? Or should you expect to have some, granted, a distant role because you're external, but some kind of ongoing role as they figure out the process?
No, I think it depends on the supplier. Some suppliers, they have a savvy staff and they're able to sort of work in this environment, But if they're cold, meaning that they had no idea this existed, there is or they don't have any staff capable of implementing an e-invoicing platform, they're going to need some hand-holding, a lot of discussions, because they got to make sure that, they have the right people to manage this process. Just because you're going to an e-invoicing platform does not mean that it can be just installed and you don't have anybody. You have to have sort of a SME or subject matter expert on staff to understand it, or you go hire one, or you, or maybe depending on the company, can actually, help you manage this as well. So it really depends on that company.
Now let's talk about that subject matter expert or point of contact for a minute. Because typically, procurement, finance, right, their main point of contact at a supplier is going to be someone in sales or account management, maybe someone in, accounts payable, right? They're going to have accounts payable, accounts receivable. But those are probably not the people that are going to make the decision to implement e-invoicing or actually start to manage it. So how would you suggest someone at a buy-side company figuring out who that right point of contact is and starting that dialogue, given that it's not someone they're otherwise naturally going to come into contact with?
Sure. I think that, one, it needs to be someone at the top, I believe, to have that initial discussion. CFO, VP, maybe VP of procurement, maybe a controller, but someone with decision-making authority to have that conversation at first. That way, you've already eliminated a key barrier within that company of implementing e-invoicing, because you would hate to start with someone that you may start with a salesperson or someone at a lower associate of that company, but at the end of the day, it's always going to make its way up to that executive.
Yeah.
That responsible executive. It may not always be the president. It may not, but it could be a CFO. It could be a VP. And you would hate to go through to have all those discussions, get up there, and they say, "Well, we're not interested," because there are other factors involved. I mean, so how much staff? And this is a good question to think about. How much staff does that company have to process these manual invoices, versus how much staff they would need going to an e-invoicing or e-commerce platform? So then you're talking about labor, right? So, reassigning that labor is an option, or something a little bit more drastic. So, that's why I say that, from my perspective, start from the top. Get sort of do your work in, at your level. So if you're talking with the sales guy, and get to understand that structure of that company, and then, but I would involve executives far sooner than later.
Absolutely. Well, and certainly if this is a small supplier that you've partnered with, but that you see enough potential to make this kind of a case, you are also potentially seeing it as a strategic relationship, right? It doesn't have to be a company of equivalent size in order for them to be an important strategic partner. And so maybe having conversations like making the case for e-invoicing actually opens a fantastic door to higher level dialogue between the two companies.
Absolutely.
So let me then kind of take you on a pivot, and bear with me, everybody listening, because I think there's a connection here and it's an interesting one, but it might not be obvious. Reggie, you recently posted a 2-part blog series on the Determined blog about tail spend. And I actually suspect that there are a couple of really important connections between procurement's challenges around tail spend and the idea of advocating for all suppliers to have e-invoicing. And the first one, I think, is probably something like tail spend mitigation, right? The more of our suppliers that have e-invoicing capabilities, I would think that would reduce the creation of new tail spend. Is that true?
I think it is, yeah. From my perspective, when we're talking about tail spend, some of the infractions on why tail spend exists is because of, one, there's no visibility into these until it's too late. Usually the invoice is probably already paid or in the system. And then also the ability to have that process, that approval process, because tail spend, and how you define tail spend, is usually those expenditures that happens outside of a procurement process. So a procurement process, if that's in place and it's working really well, can eliminate a lot of that tail spend. But then you will have that spend that is going to fall through that, and because of whatever parameters that company has in place. So when you implement an e-invoicing system, you're able to capture all of that. You put that invoice, or you place that invoice in a queue, in a workflow approval process, right? And then you also gain transparency and visibility on those invoices that come through outside of the procurement process, usually non-PO types of invoices that happen without a PO, either for emergencies or what have you. Maybe it's outside, maybe it's not from an approved supplier. But if you install this e-invoicing system, then you're able to see that invoice go through a process and a workflow approval process, so that if your company is engaged into a 3-eye principle, meaning that you have to have 3 sets of eyes on every invoice before it actually gets paid, you'll be able to see that with the e-invoice and actually gain approval.
Absolutely. Now, one of the phrases that you actually used in one of the posts, I think it's fantastic. I've not read it anywhere, but I instantly knew what you were talking about. You talked about dark procurement, right? So this is sort of like the idea of there's the dark web, right, which is where everyone's credit card goes to get stolen, and where people's identities are pirated. So, this same idea, this murky, dark procurement. Or
you buy things you're not supposed to be buying.
Exactly. Or you buy things you're not supposed to be buying. Or, here's another, or you're someone that is so tired of manually entering all these paper invoices that you just start stick it in the dark procurement. I'm just going to shove it in this corner over here. I don't have the full set of information, but it's 5 minutes till I'm meeting my friends for lunch, so I'm just going to shove it someplace. Don't worry about it. It'll get paid. Right? It's some of those things where we are reliant on human beings, A, not making mistakes, and B, not experiencing fatigue with a manual task, right? That does end up leading to some of this this tail spend. Any other thoughts about how dark procurement connects to e-invoicing and how it really does give us kind of a staircase out?
Sure, I think it. As I said before, I think it has everything to do with transparency and visibility. See, in procurement, I've been in procurement for almost 25 years, and so when we talk about the issues and the challenges with procurement, approvals, making sure that it's all part of a process, and transparency, and how you track, if you will, those expenditures from a company. It's always been challenges that we've had, especially from going from one archaic system into more of a e-platform or e-commerce platform. It just saves a lot of time. And I think when we're talking about dark purchasing, dark procurement, we're talking about the stuff that you can't see, stuff that you can't manage. And e-invoicing is like the first step to gaining control, gaining visibility, putting a process to those things that usually flow through without a process, and really saving the company money. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. When you're talking to manual processing anything manually, you're talking about more human resources. You're talking about more time spending on things that doesn't make the company money. You're talking about things, a process that's actually, or a process that's set up to encourage, if you will, theft and fraud. And then, and not being able to see any of that. And so setting up an e-invoice platform actually can eliminate, if not reduce drastically, those types of challenges and those types of things from happening.
Absolutely. Well, Reggie, we started with e-invoicing and we ended up in the murky underbelly of dark procurement, but it was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I loved it. You have a great one.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Be sure to look out for our next episode of Determine Out Loud.